Hope everybody's doing well this morning. I pulled this one up from last week because we kind of blew through it at the very end. So I wanted to bring it back up, make sure. Did everybody get this when we talked about it? I know it was just kind of at the very, very end of class. We dealt last week, of course, we're studying alleged Bible discrepancies. These are some of the instances where people will point out and say, well, I don't trust the Bible or I don't believe the Bible because there are all these contradictions. And, of course, I've learned sometimes people will make that statement and I'll say, well, that concerns me. In fact, the fellow that I mentioned to you before that kind of got me into that study of is Jesus the unique Savior of the world or is he just an average fraud? And we looked at that, for at least a couple of weeks last quarter. But the fellow that got me into that, studying that because of our discussion, one of the things he said is, well, the Bible is just, it's got a lot of contradictions, I think was the way he put it. And so I said, well, tell me what you're talking about. I want to know because I believe the Bible to be inerrant. Well, all of a sudden he says, well, I'll have to get back to you on that because I don't know any right now, but I know they're there, and I just want us to be careful whether we are Christians or even if I were in the category of a skeptic, I wouldn't want to just make assertions without having done some fact checking for myself. And so we're investigating these things because these are, you hear more and more about these from people nowadays. Kyle Butt debated Dan Barker. And in that debate, that was 2009, I believe. And in that debate, Dan Barker, he was the guy that was taking the position of, I don't think he took the position of atheism, but does anybody remember the exact proposition in that debate? Anyway, he was taking the unbelieving position, at least. And he just threw out numerous alleged discrepancies, contradictions, factual inerrancies in the Bible as he saw them. He's just bang, 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 throwing them out there. And of course, Kyle gets up and he's got a 5-minute rebuttal. There's no way he can deal with those. And that's one of the things that we've talked about in this class is that sometimes you can make an assertion in a few seconds, but it may take some serious, hardcore research to figure out, okay, what is going on here? And let's find out, is there an explanation? So keep that in mind. And one of the reasons we're studying this is because, you hear more about this. You hear some of these come up from time to time on television. Somebody asked me not all that long ago about, what was that we were talking about? Something to do with Moses and the children of Israel, I think, about coming out of Egypt. But anyway, it was something on History Channel. If I see a World War II documentary or even World War I or Vietnam War or something like that on History Channel, man, I'm going to stop and I'm going to watch it every time because it's some fantastic stuff. But if I see anything on the History Channel that has anything to do with the Bible, I'm changing the channel or I'm turning it off because they are pathetic when it comes to the Bible. And it sometimes you just want to say, have you ever bothered to read this book? Have you ever bothered to open it and really study it instead of just taking things? We talked about, we've already looked at this one, but the Ark of the Covenant versus Noah's Ark, how one fellow came across the Ark of the Covenant and the dimensions for it, and he said, well, this is ridiculous. What person would expect us to take the Bible seriously when you got this little bitty ark and we're supposed to believe that all those animals were carried on that ark? Well, it's two different arks. There's Noah's Ark, very different from the Ark of the Covenant. But sometimes you just want to ask folks, have you ever bothered to study the book and give it the benefit of the doubt that we'd give any other literary work before we just assume it's just chock full of errors? But anyway, somebody was asking me about a History Channel program, and I can't remember the exact details, but there's about a 95% chance, probably more like 99% chance, if they air anything related to the Bible, it's going to be full of errors. They'll even put on, they'll have scholars many times in a particular show who are supposedly trained religious scholars. And what they do is, and this goes back to some of the higher criticism studies that we looked at last quarter, so many times they're going to these so-called seminaries and things like that. I had a fella, one of my instructors in preacher school, used to call them, he said, better stay away from those cemeteries. But they'll go to these liberal seminaries and liberal schools and things like that, and they're being trained. Well, Matthew didn't really write Matthew. He copied from Mark. And Luke didn't really write Luke. He copied from Mark. And you put the two of them together, and you can see how much they copied from Mark and, all that stuff. So this is stuff that we hear about more and more. And also, another reason we study this is because I've been in situations, you may have been in situations where somebody says, hey, what about this? I have a problem with this. I have a question about this. This is making me wonder about the Bible. And sometimes we got the one shot, and you want to be as much as possible ready to give an answer, as 1 Peter 3:15 says. But last week we were looking at alleged numeric discrepancies. They were all pertaining to numbers. This week we'll look at a different theme. Don't think we'll get through it, but I'm ordering them like Eric Lyons does in his book, centered around different themes. But this was what we looked at last week, and we ended on this. I thought I had something highlighted here to point out. But anyways, we just moved through it very quickly, so I wanted to cover it. Talking about Jesus being seen, 1 Corinthians 15:5, he was seen of the 12. Well, Matthew 27:5 is before Jesus is resurrected. Judas cast down the pieces of silver. He, here is Judas, in the temple, departed, went and hanged himself. Peter stood up in the midst of the disciples, and he's talking there, and of course Judas is dead at that point, Acts 1:15 and 16. Although we noted that there's a very good chance Matthias would have been there. He just wouldn't have been an apostle at that time. So, the question that skeptics ask is, well, Judas was already dead. It refers to the 12. Obviously, you've got a contradiction here or a mistake by a Bible writer. And the answer to this is very easy. It's not a literal number. It's an office. You see, these are just a few references here that I've got up on the screen. We could multiply those. In fact, I just did a quick search of the 12 in my little Bible computer program. I forget how many times, and I weeded out all the ones where Jesus is not using the term the 12, or one of the Bible writers using the term the 12 to describe the office. Sometimes it would be the 12 apostles. I'd take those out. But when it just used the term the 12, amazing how many times this is done throughout the gospel accounts. So it's not a literal number, it's the office. And we noted this as we were closing, that it's like the Big Ten Conference, which actually has 12 teams. Well, nobody has a problem with that. We understand it. Originally there were 10 teams, and they expanded some. You got the Big 12, which has 10 teams. It's not an emphasis on the number. It's just the name of the conference. Maybe at one time they had 12 teams, and then a couple dropped out. So it's a title, not referencing a specific number. Yes, sir, brother.
You got to remember too that what we have, let's say the King James, most everybody has that. It's a translation of a translation of a translation already. It's already come down by the time they put together what King James wanted to be done. It had already gone through 2 or 3, maybe 4 other iterations. So if we have a more recent translation, well, it's gone through another. How many can read the original Greek or the original Hebrew? And if we go back to that, what does that say? And can you tell me the idioms that is in the original Greek or Hebrew?
Yeah. Well, and in the King James, it's a faithful translation there to call them the 12. It's just, and you use the word, it's a Hebrew, or I guess it'd be more like an Aramaic idiom. And that's where you really run into a lot of difficulties with any translation, because it's hard to, especially you want to have a literal translation, because, I want to say, for instance, I'm talking to someone, and I say, boy, it is really raining cats and dogs out there. 20 years from now, culture may be completely different. That may be being translated somewhere. Well, a faithful translation of those words would be to translate it as, it's raining cats and dogs. But in a culture where they don't understand that idiom, in fact, you could go some places today and say that, and they just say, what? My friend from Tanzania was a perfect example when we went to preaching school. Sometimes you'd say things to him, and he would just be so baffled because they were American idioms. He was telling me one time, I was kind of picking at him, and he looked up and, just kind of shakes his head, and he says, the light is on. And I said, what? And he said, the light's on. And I said, yes, Christopher, the light is on. And he says, light's on. And I said, what are you talking about? And he says, like they say, all the kids, they say the light is on. And I said, are you trying to say it's on? He says, yes, that's it, it's on. And he was thinking like a light, the light's on. So idioms are hard to, translate, at least to get the sense, because, it's exact wording, but it doesn't make sense in a literal context always. So that's true, but here's a good example of, it's just an office. And of course, we also closed with the fact that it may be prolepsis. It's like saying my wife and I dated 8 months before we got married. Well, she wasn't my wife when we were dating. Sometimes you'll see a video. Here's President Reagan when he was just a boy. He wasn't president at that time. It's prolepsis. We understand that. We use it all the time. Matthias may very well have been there when the other apostles saw Jesus. He just, at that time, was not an apostle, but when Paul wrote, he was. So, the 12. I don't think that one's very likely. I think it's probably more likely. I think it's probably 99% chance that this is what's going on. It's just looking at the sheer amount of times it's used in the New Testament as a title for the office. But I wanted to cover that because we went through that so quickly, and I was afraid somebody might not have gotten that. Today we're going to look at geographical alleged discrepancies. Some of these are a little bit more involved, but we still haven't gotten into one that's just really, really involved. There are a few of those, and I'd like to cover at least one of them or so just to show you how involved some of these can get to get to the bottom of it. You can't see that font as well as I was hoping. Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, goes against Josiah. It says here in verse, 29 of 2 Kings 23? He slew him, Pharaoh Necho slew him, Josiah, at Megiddo when he had seen him. His servants carried him in a chariot, dead from Megiddo, brought him to Jerusalem and buried him, in his own sepulcher. Then you come to 2 Chronicles, and of course I think we all understand 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles are, parallel accounts. If I remember correctly, Chronicles focuses more on the southern kingdom, and there's another emphasis in Chronicles, and I forget what that is now, but I know it focuses a lot more on the southern kingdom. You get a lot more detail on the southern kingdom. But 2 Chronicles account in chapter 35, I wish I'd used a different font. I'm having trouble seeing where I highlighted it or changed the font color to make it stick out, but it did it more on my computer screen than it does here. They brought him, Josiah, to Jerusalem, and he died and was buried in one of the sepulchres of his fathers. So they actually take him out of the first chariot, here in verse 24, put him in the second chariot. So he's shot. He says to his servants, have me away or take me out of here, for I am sore wounded. Says, I got to get out of here. So where did he die? Well, think about this. You may read a headline in the newspaper. It may say, man shot and killed in home during robbery or something like that. When the actual facts of the case are that he was shot at home, paramedics arrived, they did some work on him, they immediately put him into an ambulance, they rushed him to the hospital. He might have been dead on arrival. They might have got him to the hospital and they get him in the ER and they said, we got to get this guy into surgery, and they're working and a doctor comes out and tells the family, there's nothing we could do, we lost him. Is anybody going to, having found out that that's what happened, demand a retraction from the newspaper? Say, you guys, this is pathetic. You can't even get your facts right. The guy He wasn't killed at home. He was killed at the hospital. He died there. You know, it's figures of speech. We have to understand that the way we sometimes talk, and we'll talk about this in a minute on a general geographical note, sometimes we use expressions, we use generalizations with geography, with reference to geography, and for some reason, sometimes people don't want to give the Bible writers that same leeway. But they still did that. That's not common to our day and age. There were generalizations, and we'll see more of that as we go through these alleged discrepancies. Go ahead, brother.
I'd like to be able to relate more with Abraham Lincoln. Everybody knows that he was shot and killed at Ford's Theater, but he was shot at Ford's Theater and he died across the street 2 days later.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a good example. He was shot there at the theater, but he actually wasn't killed as far as he died at the theater. He was, what was it, across the street, right? But yeah, it was close by. So, and it actually wasn't even that same day. So, interesting. That's a good parallel. By the way, just to point out here, the phrase "and he died" is commonly used by the Bible, but it doesn't suggest anything as far as the when. Sometimes people have taken that where it says, which account is it in? I think it's here. Yeah, and he died. They brought him to Jerusalem and he died. A lot of people take that to mean, well, that what it's saying is they brought him to Jerusalem and after that he died. But it has no reference at all at the time. It's just like saying, well, they brought him to Jerusalem, and really, we talked about this in our How We Got the Bible class. I hope y'all remember that. There's no punctuation in many of these manuscripts. I mean, sometimes literally none. So it may very well be that what you need here is a pyramid. A pyramid? A period. Where did that come from? A period. Wow, sometimes things just come from nowhere. A period there. So they brought him to Jerusalem, period, and he died. In other words, we might start that sentence off saying, so he died. But it has nothing to do with the when. Here's the summation of what happened. Josiah is shot with an arrow. He's mortally wounded at Megiddo. He gives the command, take me out of here, get me home, and they rush him away, and he died sometime after issuing that command. Now, beyond that, we don't know. It doesn't tell us the exact location at the time of death. It probably was not Jerusalem, though, because it's about 50 miles away from Megiddo. And going by chariot, most experts guess that would be about a 2-hour chariot ride. And that's if you're making pretty decent time. So it's doubtful that he survived until he got to Jerusalem. He probably died somewhere en route. He was probably dead on arrival to Jerusalem. But the text doesn't tell exact location. So there's no contradiction there. There's no discrepancy. It's just putting the accounts together, you get a little bit more complete story there. Mountain or plain? Here's one. Some of these almost sound silly, but if you ever read, I mentioned last week, there's this Skeptics Annotated Bible. There are other folks that they'll try to point these things out and just say, oh, here's an example. And some of them are so silly that they almost don't bear mentioning, but these are some of the more commonly mentioned ones, so we do mention them just for that sake, if nothing else. Jesus in Matthew 5:1 is getting ready to give a sermon on the Mount. Seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him. So he's in a mountain. Then in Luke 6:17, he came down with them and stood in the plain. The company of his disciples and a great multitude of people out of all Judea and Jerusalem come to hear him. So, the fellow says, well, which is it? Is he preaching this sermon in the plain, or is he on a mountain? What's it going to be? Got a contradiction there. Well, here's the question. First of all, you got to ask, is it the same time? We talked about that. That's sometimes there's a different time under consideration. One person may say Chad is rich. One person may say Chad is poor. There are several different ways in which that's not necessarily a contradiction. Somebody may be talking, one person may be talking about spiritually poor or rich versus physically, monetarily poor or rich. Might be talking about different times. You might say Joe Smith is rich Another sentence, Joe Smith is poor. It might be that he was very wealthy. Maybe his stocks didn't do so well or whatever, or maybe there was something like 9/11 happened and the stocks just dropped and now he's just about lost it all. Or maybe he was just a scoundrel and lost it all, blew it. You could be talking about different times, and that may be what's going on here. Jesus may have preached this sermon multiple times. And I say, you tell me Jesus preached multiple sermons, preached the same sermon more than once? Y'all ever been a preacher? Hey, I tell you what, I got one in my files. In fact, I've preached it here. Psalm 29. I wrote that when I was in preaching school for Old Testament expository preaching class. And Keith Mosier is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a backslapper. And so if Brother Keith Mosier says, boy, I like that sermon, man, you preach that thing, and you get all the mileage you can out of it. And I did. I've preached that thing. I think I've counted at least 10 different places that I've preached that sermon. Tate and I used to laugh. He had a sermon, Just One Man, that Lauren's heard it a few times, I'm sure. But he preached that numerous times. He did it on GBN. Cliff Goodwin and I used to laugh. We'd compare notes, see who had preached one single sermon the most times at different places. But, preachers do that. And in fact, there are guys like the Apologetics Press guys and other folks that they go around the country doing creation versus evolution seminars and things like that. And they have their talk pretty well put together. Kind of like, guys that go around doing speeches. They may be secular speeches on some kind of educational subject. It may be some event in history. It may be something scientific. But some kind of lectures that they give, well, they research it and put just hours and hours of preparation into it, but they get that set, and then they deliver it. And then they go somewhere else and they deliver it, and it's never word for word, I suppose, unless there's some guy with a photographic memory that can memorize every single word. But it's basically the same speech. Well, it's very possible, and I might even say likely, that Jesus preached the same sermon multiple times. Matthew and Luke might just very well be referring to different occasions when he preached the same sermon. This is, I think, not the most likely answer, and that's Eric's position in his book, and I agree with him, but it is certainly a possibility. Even though I don't believe that's the most likely answer here, I don't have, I won't say I don't have any doubts, but I think it's probably highly likely that at some point Jesus preached that sermon more than once. I mean, obviously, we study the Sermon on the Mount. You can read through it, and I forget, I've heard somebody say it takes just a few minutes. It's about a 25, 30-minute sermon when you just read through it. But folks have studied that. I mean, Bible classes have spent entire quarters on it. I've heard of preachers who said, we studied that in our adult Bible class for over a year, just working our way through the Sermon on the Mount. A sermon like that's worth some extra mileage, I believe. More likely, though, the reference is to the same sermon. It's on a mountain, but a level place on the mountain. That's what that plain term means. This is common. Mountains can have level places. There's a place in Anchorage, Alaska, called Flat Top Mountain. I want to say, it's not around here. I want to say I had a friend that told me about a place in the Carolinas maybe that was also called Flat Top Mountain. But that's common. It's a mountain, but it's just a leveled out place. And so it's kind of a plain there on the mountain. No contradiction again. It's just a little bit further study. Here's a good one. Where are you from? Philip was of Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter, John 1:44. Now, you go to Mark 1:21, it says they go into Capernaum. Then you drop down to 29. Forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Well, now hold on. The house of Simon and Andrew is in Capernaum? And so the skeptic says, wait a minute. It says Andrew and Peter, or Simon is Peter. It says Andrew and Peter were of Bethsaida. So we got a contradiction there, the skeptic would say. Can't even figure out where these guys are from. And they say the same thing about Jesus. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, Matthew 2:1. And then in Acts 22:8, Jesus himself says, I am Jesus of Nazareth. Said, we're supposed to believe this is from Jesus, the Son of God, and he doesn't even know where he's from. Well, I could ask somebody, where are you from? Reagan's in here, I'm going to use her as an example. If you ask Reagan, where are you from? Well, you could get several different answers. For Peter and Andrew, they're obviously considering different times by these different writers. You ask Reagan where she's from, she might say she's from Taiwan. We joked, one of the guys at Greens Lake Road when we were there, he says, "Oh, you're made in Taiwan." She said, "No, made in America." Her mom was pregnant when they flew over to Taiwan to live there. So she might say, "I'm from Taiwan." She might say, "From Indiana." That's where most of her parents, folks are from. When they came back to the States, they lived in Cleveland, Tennessee, and Roger preached there for, 10 years or so before they moved back over to Malaysia. So she might say, "I'm from Cleveland, Tennessee." Now, if we go somewhere, like in a couple months or so, we're going to go to the marriage retreat, Lord willing, and folks might meet somebody new, and they say, "Oh, hey, where are y'all from?" Well, I'm not going to sit there and say, "Well, I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, at St. Vincent's Hospital. My parents took me home to Heflin, Alabama. I spent the better part of my life there. Later on, I moved to Memphis, and I went to preaching school, and then I went to St. Louis area." I'm not going to go through all. I'm going to say I'm from Bremen, Georgia. So, where are you from? We might joke and say it's kind of a loaded question. Ask someone who is the child of a serviceman or servicewoman, military. Where are you from? You might get a lot of answers on that. Ask a preacher's kid, where are you from? You might get a lot of different answers on that. So, depends on when you ask. So, going back to the verse here, Bethsaida is the city of Andrew and Peter. Well, that's probably where they grew up, maybe even were born. And then the house of Peter and Andrew is in Capernaum. There's no contradiction there, just different times under consideration. Just the same way if you had asked me, let's see, this is 2013. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, where are you from? I'd say I'm from Chattanooga area. Well, that's where we were at the time. But if you ask me now, I'd say I'm from Bremen. And then if you want to know where I'm originally from, then I would, mention Heflin, Alabama. Same thing for Jesus as far as where is he Jesus of Nazareth? Well, yes. He was born in Bethlehem, but he grew up in Nazareth. I was born in Birmingham. I mentioned that earlier. But if you ask me, I'm going to say I'm from Bremen. Oh, you want to know where I'm from originally? Heflin. Well, originally, I guess if you wanted to get real technical, you'd say I'm from St. Vincent's Hospital in Birmingham. But we understand that. Again, these are expressions and generalizations that we use every single day. We don't blink an eye. We don't think twice. But people come to the Bible, and all of a sudden it's trickery. Why oh, you're just trying to explain things away. Well, I've never been accused of lying when I tell somebody I'm from Heflin, and then maybe later on they find out, wait a minute, I found out you were born in Birmingham. You're a liar, Chad. You told me you were from Heflin. Nobody's ever said that to me. I don't anticipate that they will. We understand there are just certain generalizations that we use. How many blind men in Jericho? Now, there's another one we could talk about with Jericho that I didn't mention because we've talked about it before. In Luke chapter 10, leading into the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus says a certain man went down to Jericho from Jerusalem. And, for a while, critics would take that and say, well, there's an error because Jericho is where? It's north. But to get to Jericho from Jerusalem, you travel south geographically, but you literally go down. It's over 2,000 feet, and over 2,000 foot descent from Jerusalem to Jericho, because Jerusalem's up on a mountain, and Jericho is actually below sea level, as I recall. So it's absolutely correct to say a certain man went down to Jericho from Jerusalem. But we've talked about that before, so I just didn't include that here. This is Mark's account. He's got Jesus meets blind Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus. He sat by the highway side begging. That's Mark's account. Now in Matthew, you've got two blind men. So the critics will say, and skeptics, they'll say, well, here you go. There's your contradiction. Because one of them says it's one blind man, the other one says two. By the way, this is Mark's account. Luke also has one. Luke does not call him by name, but he just has the one blind man. Matthew says there were two. Contradiction, they say. Well, let's talk about that. First of all, note that Mark and Luke do not say only one blind man. If they did, then we'd have a problem. If they said Jesus is coming, he's there, and there was just this one lone blind man, and then Matthew comes along and says two, now we got a problem. But they didn't say that. Somebody may say, Chad, does Chad have a son? Yeah, he's got a son. Somebody else may come along and say, Chad has three sons. A typo there. Somebody else may say, Chad has 3 sons. Is that a contradiction? Just give him more information. Do I have a son? Yes. Do I have 3 sons? Yes. Somebody else may come along and say, Chad has 3 sons and a daughter. Still no contradictions, just extra information. These accounts supplement one another. Mark's focus on the one, including calling both Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, may indicate that he knew that fellow personally. And, if you're living in the time of Jesus and there's all these amazing miracles going on, a lot of healing, and somebody you know personally gets healed, then chances are you're going to focus on that person when you write about it. So, may very well be, we don't know that for sure, but it may be that Mark knew that fella personally. But these accounts are supplementing one another. Mark and Luke say there's one guy there and they're just focusing on him. They didn't say that he was the only one. But Matthew gives us a little extra information and says there are actually 2 blind men. Now this next alleged discrepancy goes right with this. Coming or going? Going back to these accounts. Mark's account. They came to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho, he meets Bartimaeus. Now, Matthew 20, as they departed from Jericho. So here you got Matthew and Mark lining up pretty nicely, but then Luke comes along and says, it came to pass as he was coming nigh unto Jericho. Hold the phone, says somebody. Was he coming in or was he going out? Can't be both, right? So which is it? Was he coming into Jericho when he healed these people? Or was he going out? Skeptics sometimes will say, well, if I grant you that Matthew is supplementing Mark and Luke with adding this extra blind man and telling us about him, how are you going to reconcile this? Is it coming or is it going? Well, think about this. There's a possibility. I'll go ahead and tell you, I don't think this is the answer. But it is absolutely possible. It's possible that 3 blind men were healed in the vicinity of Jericho. The event recorded by Luke would then be different from the event recorded by Matthew and Mark. So as he's coming near Jerusalem, Jericho, as he's coming near Jericho, he heals a blind man. Then, later as he's coming out of Jericho, he heals these other 2 blind men. That's a possibility, but again, I just don't know that I think that's the most likely one. But it is at least bolstered by the reference by Luke to a multitude in Luke 18:36, whereas Matthew and Mark refer to a great multitude. If he heals one man coming into Jericho, the word's going to spread and the multitude's going to multiply, and that would explain this larger crowd as he's coming out of Jericho to see the healing of the 2 blind men. I think this is probably the more likely explanation. Did you know there were 2 Jerichos in Jesus' time? You say, man, you expect me to believe that? You ever been to Kansas City? Which side? Kansas City, Missouri, or Kansas City, Kansas? There's a Kansas City on either side of the line there. There are 2 Jerichos in Jesus' time. There was Old Testament Jericho. It was a small village. It was still inhabited, but it was mostly ruins. It was not like the big Jericho that you read about a lot in the Old Testament. Mostly in ruins. But then there was this new city of Jericho that was built by Herod the Great. It was about 2 miles south. And so they're so close together, they both just took the name. Of course, the other one obviously kept the name Jericho. But the new city was still referred to as Jericho. Sometimes historians will refer to it as Herodian Jericho. But to my knowledge, I don't see any indication that I haven't studied it extensively, but I don't see any indication that people in that time ever referred to it in any way except Jericho, whether they were talking about either city. So there were two different Jerichos. Traveling toward Jerusalem, Jesus would have passed through Old Jericho first. Of course, he's on his way to Jerusalem if you study this in its context. He'd have passed through Old Jericho first, then Herodian Jericho. And so, if that is the case, that this is explained by the fact that there are two different Jerusalems, we'd have Luke referring to New Jericho. So what happens, he passes through Old Jericho, this small village, and as he's coming out, he heals these blind men. But as you come out of Old Jericho, you're nigh or near to New or Herodian Jericho. So there's two blind men, they're healed. Matthew gives us extra information by telling us there was another blind man, it wasn't just one. It's coming out of Old Jericho, coming into New Jericho. Again, the Kansas City example, somebody could say, we had a flat tire coming out of KC, Kansas City. And then somebody else may be telling it who was in the same vehicle and say, we had a good trip, but boy, right as we were about to come into Kansas City, we had a flat tire. And somebody said, hold on now. Your buddy here says you had a flat tire coming out of Kansas City. Well, yeah, that's right. It's not possible. That's a contradiction. Well, we understand. When you talk, it depends on, the one fellow says we were coming out of Kansas City, Missouri. The other one said, oh, yeah, well, I meant we were coming into Kansas City, Kansas. So we get that. Time we got. Let's do this one real quick. Jesus, before he ascended up into heaven, he led them out as far as to Bethany, lifted up his hands and blessed them. While he blessed them, he was parted from them, carried up into heaven. Now, that's Luke 24. Acts 1, 9, and 12. While they beheld, he was taken up in the cloud, received him out of their sight. Then returned they unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet. So people say, well, here it says he ascended from Bethany in Luke 24. Acts 1 says he ascended from Olivet. So which is it? Well, is this a contradiction? Again, this is what I wanted to get to because we've talked about general notes on geography about using a lot of flexibility with language. Think about the Dallas Cowboys. Where do they actually play? Irving, Texas. They don't actually play in Dallas. But nobody accuses anybody of a contradiction when they call that team the Dallas Cowboys. The Braves are getting ready to move to Cobb County, right? Isn't that new facility going to be in Marietta? To my knowledge, I don't think they're going to become the Marietta Braves. I'm pretty sure they're still going to be the Atlanta Braves. Anybody been to Six Flags in Atlanta? But it's not in Atlanta. Where is it? It's Austell. Is that how you say it, Austell? You look up the address. It's not actually an Atlanta address. We understand that. We don't have any problem with that. I'm from Heflin, but I'm actually, if you know Chula Finney, you know Cleveland County. But I'm from, if you want to get real technical about it, I'm from Chula Finney. But I just tell people I'm from Heflin. It's amazing enough if somebody knows where Heflin is. When I was in Memphis, or especially when I moved up to St. Louis area, people say, where are you from? Birmingham. I just say Birmingham. I might say, you ever heard of Anniston, Oxford? People say, Heflin. So if I really want to get a rise out of somebody, I say, I'm from Chula Finney, Alabama. Eastridge, we lived up there. We lived in Eastridge for a little while, and you can actually send a letter to somebody in Eastridge and put the city and state, Eastridge, Tennessee, 37412. Or you can put Chattanooga, Tennessee, 37412. Gets there either way. So, we use a lot of flexibility. The account of Jesus' ascension, it does the same thing. Luke doesn't say he ascended from Bethany. Other versions have verse 50 as saying they were near Bethany or in the vicinity of Bethany, and that's a really better translation there. Bethany is about a mile and 3/4 from Jerusalem, and notice this, it's on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. So Luke's just using different geographical references to establish the location. No problem there. Remember, when it comes to geography, we got a couple more of these that we'll cover next week, Lord willing. But we use a lot of flexibility when we're talking about geographical things. The Bible writers did too. That's not new to our day and age. They did that as well. So we'll take a break, stop there, and as I said, we'll finish these up. Probably get I think we're close enough to the end. Yeah, we'll get through and start a new topic of alleged discrepancies next week, Lord willing. Thank y'all very much. We'll break before worship.